Good afternoon and welcome to our press conference. I'm joined on stage by President Lagarde and Vice President de Guindos. My name is Wolfgang Preußel. For our online participants, if you ask a question, please turn on your cameras and your microphones. And with that, I hand over to President Lagarde, please.
Thank you so much and welcome to all of you after this summer break that I hope you enjoyed. The Vice President and I welcome you to our press conference. Inflation continues to decline, but is still expected to remain too high for too long. We are determined to ensure that inflation returns to our 2% medium-term target in a timely manner. In order to reinforce progress towards our target, the Governing Council today decided to raise the three key ECB interest rates by 25 basis points. The rate increase today reflects our assessment of the inflation outlook in light of the incoming economic and financial data, the dynamics of underlying inflation, and the strength of monetary policy transmission. The September ECB staff macroeconomic projections for the euro area see average inflation at 5.6% in 23, 3.2% in 24, and 2.1% in 2025. This is an upward revision for 23 and 24 and a downward revision for 25. The upward revision for 23 and 24 mainly reflects a higher path for energy prices. Underlying price pressures remain high, even though most indicators have started to ease. ECB staff have slightly revised down the projected path for inflation, excluding energy and food, to an average of 5.1% in 23, 2.9% in 24, and 2.2% in 25. Our past interest rate increases continue to be transmitted forcefully. Financing conditions have tightened further and are increasingly dampening demand, which is an important factor in bringing inflation back to target. With the increasing impact of our tightening on domestic demand and the weakening international trade environment, ECB staff have lowered their economic growth projections significantly. They now expect the euro area economy to expand by 0.7% in 23, 1% in 24, and 1.5% in 25. Based on our current assessment, we consider that the key ECB interest rates have reached levels that, maintained for a sufficiently long duration, will make a substantial contribution to the timely return of inflation to our target. Our future decisions will ensure that the key ECB interest rates will be set at sufficiently restrictive levels for as long as necessary. We will continue to follow a data-dependent approach to determining the appropriate level and duration of restrictions. In particular, our interest rate decisions will be based on our assessment of the inflation outlook in light of the incoming economic and financial data, the dynamics of underlying inflation, and the strength of monetary policy transmission. The decisions taken today are set out in a press release, which is available on our website. I will now outline in more detail how we see the economy and inflation developing, and will then explain our assessment of financial and monetary conditions. So turning to the economic activity. The economy is likely to remain subdued in the coming months. It broadly stagnated over the first half of the year, and recent indicators suggest it has also been weak in the third quarter. Lower demand for the euro area's exports and the impact of tight financing conditions are dampening growth, including through lower residential and business investment. The services sector, which had so far been resilient, is now also weakening. Over time, economic momentum should pick up as real income are expected to rise, supported by falling inflation, rising wages, and a strong labor market, and this will underpin consumer spending. The labor market has so far remained resilient despite the slowing economy. The unemployment rate stayed at its historical low of 6.4% in July. While employment grew by 0.2% in the second quarter, momentum is slowing. The services sector, which has been a major driver of employment growth since 2022, is now also creating fewer jobs. As the energy crisis fades, governments should continue to roll back the related support measures. This is essential to avoid driving up medium-term inflationary pressures, which would otherwise call for an even stronger monetary policy response. Fiscal policies should be designed to make our economy more productive and to gradually bring down high public debt. Policies to enhance the euro area's supply capacity, which should be supported by the full implementation of the Next Generation EU programme, can help reduce price pressures in the medium term while supporting the green transition. The reform of the EU's economic governance framework should be concluded before the end of this year, and progress towards capital market union should be accelerated. Looking now at inflation. Inflation declined to 5.3% in July, but remained at that level in August, according to Eurostat's flash estimate. Its decline was interrupted because energy prices rose compared with July. Food price inflation has come down from its peak in March, but was still almost 10% in August. In the coming months, the sharp price increases recorded in the autumn of 2022 will drop out of the yearly rates, thus pulling inflation down. Inflation, excluding energy and food, fell to 5.3% in August from 5.5% in July. Goods inflation declined to 4.8% in August from 5% in July and 5.5% in June, owing to better supply conditions, previous drops in energy prices, easing price pressures in the earlier stages of production chain, and weaker demand. Services inflation edged down to 5.5%, but was still kept up by strong spending on holidays and travel and by the high growth of wages. The annual growth rate of compensation per employee remained constant at 5.5% in the second quarter of the year. The contribution of labor cost to annual domestic inflation increased in the second quarter, in part owing to weaker productivity, while the contribution of profits fell for the first time since early 2022. Most measures of underlying inflation are starting to fall as demand and supply have become more aligned and the contribution of past energy price increases is fading out. At the same time, domestic price pressures remain strong. Most measures of longer-term inflation expectations currently stand at around 2%, but some indicators have increased and need to be monitored closely. So what's our risk assessment? The risks to economic growth are tilted to the downside. Growth could be slower if the effects of monetary policy are more forceful than expected, or if the world economy weakens, for instance, owing to a further slowdown in China. Conversely, Growth could be higher than projected if the strong labor market, rising real incomes, and receding uncertainty mean that people and businesses become more confident and spend more. Upside risks to inflation include potential renewed upward pressures on the cost of energy and food. Adverse weather conditions and the unfolding climate crisis more broadly could push food prices up by more than expected. A lasting rise in inflation expectations above our target or higher than anticipated increases in wages or profit margins could also drive inflation higher, including over the medium term. By contrast, weaker demand, for example, due to a stronger transmission of monetary policy or a worsening of the economic environment outside the euro area, would lead to lower price pressures, especially over the medium term. Turning now to the financial and monetary conditions. Our monetary policy tightening continues to be transmitted strongly to broader financing conditions. Funding has again become more expensive for banks as savers are replacing overnight deposits with time deposits that pay more interest, and the ECB's targeted longer-term refinancing operations are being phased out. Average lending rates for business loans and mortgages continued to increase in July to 4.9% and 3.8% respectively. Credit dynamics have weakened further. Loans to firms grew at an annual rate of 2.2% in July, down from 3% in June. Loans to households also grew less strongly, by 1.3% after 1.7% in June. In annualized terms, based on the last 3 months of data, household loans declined by 0.8%, which is the strongest contraction since the start of the euro. Amid weak lending and the reduction in the Eurosystem balance sheet, the annual growth rate of M3 fell from 0.6% in June to an all-time low of minus 0.4% in July. In annualized terms over the past 3 months, M3 contracted by 1.5%. So in conclusion, inflation continues to decline, but is still expected to remain too high for too long. We are determined to ensure that inflation returns to our 2% medium-term target in a timely manner. In order to reinforce progress towards our target, the Governing Council today decided to raise the 3 key ECB interest rates by 25 basis points. Based on our current assessment, we consider that the key ECB interest rates have reached levels that, maintained for a sufficiently long duration, will make a substantial contribution to the timely return of inflation to our target. Our future decisions will ensure that the key ECB interest rates will be set at sufficiently restrictive levels for as long as necessary. We will continue to follow a data-dependent approach to determining the appropriate level and duration of restriction. In any case, we stand ready to adjust all of our instruments within our mandate to ensure that inflation returns to our medium-term target and to preserve the smooth functioning of monetary policy transmission. We are now ready to take your questions.
Thank you, Madame Lagarde. And the first question goes to Annette Weisbach of CNBC. Annette, please.
President Lagarde, thank you very much. My first question would go, a general one. How did the discussion go? Because clearly before going into the meeting, there was much room for the so-called doves, but also the hawks. So how did you come to a compromise? And the second question, is that a dovish hike, meaning that's it now? Or is it a hawkish pause? Of course not a hawkish pause, but is that the end of the rate hiking cycle, or do you leave the door open?
Thank you very much for your two questions. So how did the discussion go? We had a lot of data, a lot of analysis done by staff. And obviously this was a projection meeting and projections that was prepared by the ECB staff. So we looked very closely at all those data. And to give you an example, we spent hours and hours yesterday, morning and afternoon, with the usual presentation by staff in the morning and by the chief economist and the member of the executive board responsible for markets, to have as much as possible intelligence, numbers, analysis. And I'm pleased to say that at the end of this morning session, we came to the conclusion that we shared the analysis that was conducted on GDP, on inflation, on anticipation. And obviously some members did not draw the same conclusion. And some governors would have preferred to pause and reserve future decision once more certainty, more intelligence would have resulted from the passing of time and the impact of our many previous decisions. But I can tell you that there was a solid majority of the governors to agree with the decision that we have made and that I have just read to you. So yes, there are a few members in the Governing Council who would have preferred another one, and we had to rely, as I told you, on a solid majority. It is not the practice to give numbers of who did what and when, but suffice to say that the majority was solid. And it was a very, I don't want you to believe that we had an antagonistic adversarial discussion. We really went deep into the numbers and the analysis and tried to really take into account the sensitivity analysis, the scenarios that were provided by staff, really discuss the baseline and the impact of our measures in the past. And I'm happy to go through the process that we followed in terms of reasoning. Now, on your second question, is the door open or is the door closed? It was a beautiful theater play by Marivaux who said that a door has to be either opened or closed. But this is theater. And what we have decided is actually reflected in that key paragraph, which I have read twice because it is in the body of the text, which was released to you earlier, and also in the conclusion of the text, which is that, and it has caveats, based on our current assessment. So it is based on all the data, the numbers, the analysis, the assessment, the projections, and any other information that we have available. We consider that the key ECB interest rates have reached levels, okay, note levels, that, maintained for sufficient long duration. So there is the time element that comes up, will make a substantial contribution, those are heavy words, to the timely return of inflation to our target. And that we don't stop here. The whole paragraph is important and needs to be read in symbiosis. So the next sentence says, our future decisions will ensure that the key ECB rates will be set at, repeating, sufficiently restrictive level. That's number one. For as long as necessary, number two. Those are really two parameters that are going to guide us very much. Not that we are forgetting about the three components that have guided our reasoning so far, and we continue. We will continue to follow a data-dependent approach. You've heard that before. Data-dependent approach to determining the appropriate level and duration of restrictions. In particular, our interest rate decisions will be based on our assessment, and I repeat there, it's in the text, number one, inflation outlook in the light of the incoming economic and financial data. Number two, the dynamics of underlying inflation. Number three, the strength of monetary policy transmission. So that addresses your question, and I think that the exegesis that no doubt some of you will conduct in relation to substantial contribution and how that substantial contribution contributes to means significant level maintained for as long as necessary based on current assessment gives you the answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Now turning to our online participants, I'd like to give the floor to Balázs Korani of Reuters. Balázs, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking my questions. First question is about asset purchases, President Lagarde. Is 2024 carved in stone for PEP reinvestments? And if not, do you expect a discussion on the APP? Do you expect a discussion about outright sales of bonds? The second question is about the growth outlook, which is about, I guess the question is whether a recession is becoming your base case for the Eurozone. Do you expect a recession perhaps in the third and fourth quarters, or do you still believe that the quarterly numbers continue to remain positive?
Thank you very much for your two questions. On your first question, we regard interest rates as the key tool in the work that we are doing in order to reach our 2% medium-term target. So we have not discussed the PEP program and the reinvestment and the forward guidance. PEP is our flexibility instrument, as you know, and is the first line of defense if we want to defend proper transmission of our monetary policy. We have not either discussed any kind of APP outright sale. And on your second question, I want to... Sorry, you're missing a little bit of happening here on the floor because something is falling. But you're not with us, so I have to tell you what's going on here. So you are correct, Balázs, that the GDP has been revised significantly. We moved from 0.9 to 0.7 in 23, and more importantly, we moved from the 1.5 to 1% in 24. But let me just take a moment to explain to you what seems like the biggest revision, which is 2024. Most of it, actually 3/4 of that revision, 0.5, is actually attributable to carry over from 23. So we are going through a period of about 5 quarters of very, very sluggish growth. And we are, based on our projection, coming to the end of it, and the pickup according to the same calendar, the same quarter calendar that we have had in the June projection, picks up again in 24. The downgrade from 1.5 to 1, as I said, is carryover from 23. In 25, we have a small revision, and we move from 1.6 to 1.5, which is really a minimal revision. But in essence, the recovery that we had planned for the second half of 23 is actually pushed out into time for various reasons that I'm happy to expand upon. But that's what we are seeing.
Thank you. And the next question goes to Alex Weber of Bloomberg. Alex, please.
Good afternoon. Here. I'm over here.
Oh.
I had 2 questions as usual. You say that the current level of interest rates will make a substantial contribution to fighting inflation if maintained for a sufficiently long period of time. Did you have a discussion in the Governing Council what sufficiently long means in practice, for how long rates will have to stay at the peak at the very least? And then as recently as when you gave a speech in Sintra, you said the ECB is unlikely to be able to call the peak in interest rates in the near future. Just wondering what exactly made you decide that now's the time to at least allude to the fact more strongly. Thank you.
You know, I'm not going to annoy you with the rereading, but you obviously all picked up that the level, our two key determination are level sufficiently restrictive for long enough so that we are confident that we are reaching the 2% medium-term target. And as indicated in that paragraph that I have read, under current assessment, we believe that the interest rates that we decide will provide a substantial contribution to that target. But with the two elements, sufficiently restrictive, number one, for long enough. Now, your real question is, did you discuss the long enough? And the answer to that is no, because we're also saying in the same breath that we will be data dependent. So what we want to do is continue to be data dependent and test our assessment that I have just described for you against future projections and subsequent assessment. That's what we are tasked to do, with the determination to reach the 2% medium-term target in a timely manner. Now, you had a second question. Oh yeah, Sintra.
Speech.
You know, we are not saying, I'm not changing anything from Sintra. I stand by what I said and I wrote in Sintra. And we are not either saying that we are now at peak. I think the sentence that I read is really the critical one. With today's decision, we have made sufficient contributions under current assessment to returning inflation to target in a timely manner. And as I said, both elements matter, the level, sufficiently restrictive, and the duration. But it's obvious that the focus is probably going to move a bit more to the duration, but it is not to say, because we can't say that now, that we are at peak.
Right. And the next
So
question.
I know it's complicated because the as long as necessary cannot be actually pinned down, and the substantial contribution cannot be either pinned down, because it's every time an assessment that we have to conduct against the data, against the analysis, against the various information that we derive from experts, and against the projections and what our staff offers.
Okay, thank you. And now the next question goes to Aude Kersilek of BFM Business. Aude, please.
Thank you for having my question. At Jackson Hole, you told that the ECB has to maintain its credibility with the public. How do you evaluate the ECB's current credibility? And second question is, 15 years after Lehman collapse, do you think that banking system in Europe is safe from such a crisis? And what about the shadow banking?
Those are big questions, you know. So on credibility of a central bank, I know that the experts will give you probably a lot of measurements and surveys and indicators to determine whether the central bank, ours or any other central bank, is credible, is losing credibility, is gaining credibility. What I know is that the ECB is on a positive path directionally. But my definition of credibility is that we deliver on our mandate. Our credibility on the line is to reach the 2% medium term in a timely manner. And we will do everything we have to do in order to deliver on that. That's credibility. You have a mandate, you have to deliver against that mandate. On the stability and strength of banks, my dear Vice President.
Good afternoon.
Oh, thanks.
Well, 15 years after Lehman, I think that the situation of the banking industry in Europe is totally different. Banks are much more resilient. This is something that we have reiterated several times. The capital levels, the quality and the level of liquidity are not comparable to the situation 15 years ago. And I think that that makes a big difference. And I think that we have a very good example, what happened in March. In the US and with Credit Suisse, these kind of events didn't have any impact on the European banks. And after that, we had our stress test exercise that indicated that the European banks, that they are resilient, that they can withstand even a very severe scenario. And I think that this is a proof that the situation has changed quite a lot for better. Perhaps now the attention is much more on the non-bank part of the financial system. I think that there, in terms of financial stability, we have identified many more vulnerabilities now, but that's the focus of attention that we are putting now in terms of financial stability.
Thank you, Vice President. The next question would go to Martin Arnold of the Financial Times. Martin, please.
Thank you. President Lagarde, 2 questions from me. Firstly, what do you say to people who might accuse you of making a likely recession worse and adding to the woes of the Eurozone economy? Second question is to ask you whether the expectations that national central banks and the European Central Bank are likely to make sizable losses in coming years, is that having any impact on your discussions? Is that something that is having any impact on your decisions at the ECB? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. I will dispose of the second because I think it's going to be a fast response to your point about whether the likelihood or possibility of national central banks or the ECB to make loss, does that impact on our decision-making process and our decision? The answer to that is no. Because, and in a way it addresses also now your first question. No, because the objective that we have, the mandate that we were given is price stability. It is not to make profit. It is to procure price stability within the euro area. And I would observe that the fight that we are leading, we're not the only one, but the fight that we're leading against inflation is making progress. And what we're doing today is trying to reinforce that progress. Remember back in October, we were at 10.6. We're down to 5.3 now. So it's been divided by half. Is it satisfactory? No, because it is, and it is expected by our projection to still remain too high and for too long. But inflation has declined, and we want it to continue to decline and to reinforce that process. And we're doing that not because we want to force a recession, but because we want price stability to be there for people who are taking the brunt of inflation, high prices, and predominantly so those who are not the most privileged people.
Thank you, President Lagarde. And the next question goes to M&I, let me just check the name, Santiago Pinol. I'm sorry. Santiago, please.
From Spain?
Santiago Pinol of M&I.
Hello, good afternoon. My question is, if the data dependent and held for long are at odds at each other, and if this can be contradictory, and if you are prepared to cut rates if growth slows further. In other words, it's sufficiently restrictive, that sentence could imply a cut. Thank you.
This is not even a word that we have pronounced. But yes, the data dependency applies to both the determination of the sufficiently restrictive level, as well as the length of time where it has to stay at that level. So we don't see any contradiction in terms in having the two components in the same sentence. One will drive the other, actually. And on your other, I think I addressed your second one.
Thank you. Then Christian Siedenbiel of Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Christian, please.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Madame Lagarde, how much are the problems in the real estate market affecting the ECB?
Well, thank you for the question, because that's certainly an area, whether you're looking at residential real estate, which affects, obviously, at the end of the day, households and people, or whether you look at commercial real estate, this is a sector that is clearly responding very much to the current circumstances. The level of interest rates and the financing tightening that we are conducting to bring inflation down is one of the factors that that cause this overall real estate sector to be in a difficult situation at the moment. I mean, we're not oblivious to it; we know it, and you know, as I said to Mr. Arnold earlier on, we are not driven to sustain and support a particular sector. We are driven by the imperative of delivering on our mandate, which is price stability. And we want to do that timely.
Thank you. And the next question goes to Eshe Nelson of the New York Times. Eshe, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Isha Nelson from the New York Times. Can I ask for your assessment on the pace and the strength of the transmission of monetary policy? You noted the fastest contraction in household loans. Do you feel that monetary policy is transmitting as quickly as you would like, too quickly, too strongly, or slow enough? And then in the past, you've talked a lot about the ability for wages to keep rising as long as companies absorb those labor costs in their profits. Are you starting to see that be possible, or is there a risk of either kind of wages diminishing or profits returning to where they were?
Well, thank you so much for the two questions. On the transmission channel. On the transmission channel, there is evidence that the current hiking cycle is transmitting to financing conditions faster than previous ones. So you will remember that we use three criterias, three elements in our assessment. One is the inflation outlook, the second one is underlying inflation, and the third one is the strength of monetary policy transmission. On the third one, I think we all shared the same view in the room earlier today, that this channel of transmission is strong and stronger than we have seen in previous cycles. So when you look at how fast it transmits to various rates, whether it's overnight or whether it is longer term, it's extremely rapid. And it's reflected in the lending rates for corporate, in the lending rates for household, which I think I mentioned as 393, and in the monetary policy statement. There is a transmission, and it is having a constraining impact that is visible when you look at M3, when you look at the volume of loans, when you look at the interest rate. So it's really clearly the fact that transmission is effective, and more so than in the past. Your second question. So one of the bright spots that we have in terms of activity in the euro area is the labor market. The labor market is still going strongly. The employees' wages is growing. The employee remuneration is still increasing at 5.5%. And the participation has increased by 0.2%. We are beginning to see some signs of weakening in the volume of hires, and notably in some sectors that are related, particularly in the service sector that is related to manufacturing. We are beginning to see some signs. But overall, when I look at my numbers today, it's employees' remuneration plus 5.5, employees' participation in the economy 0.2 plus, and the lowest unemployment rates we ever had. So, and we're looking very, very carefully at that, because it's having a serious impact on inflation, particularly inflation in the service sector, which is typically much more labor intensive. Now, what are we seeing in terms of profit? When we look at profit unit cost and its growth, it is still growing. But that growth is, for the first time, having an inflection downwards. So that would comfort the assumption that we have made throughout. We made that at the June projection. We are making it yet again. It comforts the projection that gradually profit will squeeze in order to allow for the wage increases. We're beginning to see it. This is the first time. So we want to be confident that that is a lasting component. It should normally be so, because as demand is dampened, it should normally be the reaction in the corporate world. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I saw Chiara De Felice of ANSA asking for the floor, right? Or did I not? No, that's okay. Then Eric Albert of Le Monde, please.
Thank you very much for taking my question. I'd like to come back on the housing market. You've mentioned, of course, that interest rate hikes have dampened the housing market, but how much of a drag on overall growth is it? How much of a systemic risk is it? And that might also be a question for Mr. De Guindos. And then in your first question, in your first answer, you were saying you could elaborate on how you reached the conclusion of doing a hike today, despite the risk. Could you please elaborate? I mean, how do you reach this conclusion of yes, a hike is needed after all?
Shall I take the second one and then you take the first? Okay, so I'll take your second one. I'll take you through the reasoning that we adopted. We had indicated, and we are, bound by that intellectual reasoning, that we would approach the assessment using three key criteria: inflation outlook, underlying inflation, strength of the transmission of monetary policy. As I said earlier on the third criteria, there is no question in anybody's mind around the governing council table, if you want to sort of propel yourself into that room. There was shared analysis of that, with little variations at the margin. On the first item, which is the inflation outlook, well, we looked at the projections that were given to us by ECB staff. We looked at experts' reading and analytical work. And when you look at the projection, you see that, I was going to say, notwithstanding the GDP revision, we have a revision upward of headline inflation in both 23 and 24, and a 0.1 revision downward for 25, which is, hallowed with uncertainty, because the further out you go into the projection, the less certain it is. On the core inflation, which we look at as well, not only one, but we also look at core inflation. Core inflation is maintained in 23 and revised by 0.1 in 24 and 25. But overall, we are not at target in 25 on headline inflation. And we are almost on target on core, and we only hit around 2% in the fourth quarter of 25. So when we look at that, we ask ourselves, okay, inflation outlook, how does that compare with our commitments and our target? Not there yet. And as I said, it's the key sentence in that monetary policy statement. Under current assessment, with this decision of 25 basis points hike, we believe that we are making a substantial contribution to blah, 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 blah. I will not annoy you with repeating yet again. So those are the elements that we take into account. And then the real purpose of what we're doing here is not to be found in that sentence. It's somewhere else in the beginning of the document that you have, where we say, I hope I can find it for you right away. Yeah, it's in the first paragraph where we say, in order to reinforce progress towards our target, the Governing Council today decided to raise the 3 key ECB interest rates by 25 basis points. We want to reinforce progress. We want to be as timely as is possible. And by doing that, we support our projections with a higher degree of confidence. And I think it will reinforce progress towards targets. So we are determined to get there to that 2%. And we see that as the best way to accelerate the process. And by the way, it also reinforces the anchoring of inflation expectations, which are broadly at 2, but which warrant monitoring.
On how much of a drag is the property market for the financial system? Well, I will follow what the President has indicated before. I think that we have 2 different situations. In the case of the residential market, what we have started to see is that there is a slowdown in the evolution of prices in residential property. Whereas in the case of the commercial property, commercial real estate, the situation is different because we identified a decline in prices even before the tightening cycle of monetary policy. This was related to the situation of COVID, teleworking, and this kind of things. We have made a lot of analysis about the potential impact that commercial property might have in the financial system, and we have identified some channels, some links between commercial property, commercial real estate, and mutual funds that would reinforce the comment that I have made before about non-banks as a potential source of vulnerabilities for the financial system. I think that this is the element that we are trying to analyze. There are real estate funds, property funds, that have a lot of investments and a lot of great exposure to the commercial property. This is something that we have to look at and monitor very closely.
Thank you. And the next question goes to Silvia Berzoni of the Italian TV channel Class TV.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, President.
Good afternoon.
So given the sharp...
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno. So given the sharp downward revision to GDP in 2024, which you have already explained, but can you give us a sense of how concerned is the Governing Council about the chance of a recession, and especially in places and countries like Italy, where most, if not all, the economic activity depends on banks?
Well, I think it's in all countries that economic activity depends on financing. So in Europe, it's largely banks, but it's not something that is, peculiar to Italy. Banks in Europe play a critical role in financing the economic activity, both for corporates and for households. We are going through a phase of very sluggish growth. We move from 0 to 0.1 to 0, revised 0.1, revised 0.1. And we see also very weak signs, whether you look at PMI, whether you look at the gap between manufacturing and services that is now being reduced. We are clearly in a period of slow and sluggish growth. But as I said, the revision that we're making for next year, where we're moving from 1.5 to 1% of growth, is for 3/4 of that revision attributable to the sluggish growth that we are going through at the moment. So the difficult times are now. And the recovery that we had anticipated is pushed out into 24. And when you look at the September projection that we have on a quarter-by-quarter basis, it is the same as the one that we had in June, which shows that we are confident that growth will pick up in 24. Now, of course, we need to succeed. We need to bring inflation down, and wages have to be sustained, and labor has to hold. Those are some of the assumptions that we make in that respect.
Thank you. And the last question goes today to our online participant, Mark Boinderman of the Dutch daily NRC Handelsblad. Mark, please.
Thank you very much. Lagarde, you alluded to the risk of food inflation picking up because of adverse weather conditions related to climate change. I know this happened in 22 already. Have you got concrete indications that this is happening again, and this could in fact impact the inflation number? And related to that, my second question is, has the ECB made any progress in thinking about how to make its operations aligned with the Paris Agreement in times of monetary tightening still? Thank you.
Sure. Sure, thank you very much. On the first one, as I said, the food inflation has come down, but it is still at 10% at the moment. So it is still hard for people because food is obviously a component of the basket, which matters a lot and which matters more for those who earn less. We know that for a fact. So we hope that food will continue to go down, but it's one of the components that is still very high. Maybe I would enlarge your question to the price of commodities in general, because we are seeing movements, whether it is on grains, whether it is on, and obviously the Black Sea Agreement denunciation by Russia is flying in the face of stability, if anything. But whether it's grain, whether it's oil, whether it's gas, we're looking at all those components very, very carefully because some of them are volatile, some of them are on the way up, and they will have consequences on prices. I think we will have to assess on a projection by projection basis to really appreciate what impact it has in view of activity around the world as well. You know, we had a good scenario analysis produced by staff about China and the role that China growth or deceleration of growth would have on our own GDP and our inflation. That combined with the price of oil is obviously something that we need to be attentive to. On the compliance with the Paris Agreement, as you know, because of the tilting program that we have put in place since last October, that we have improved and modified, we can tell you very seriously that until the end of 23, we are Paris compliant. What I can also tell you is that we need to look at other measures and more measures in order to make sure going forward that we will remain Paris compliant, given the fact that we are gradually, we have phased out any reinvestment under the APP, and under the PEP, the volume of corporate bonds is extremely limited. So we will be looking at that, and there will be work done by staff to propose options in order to remain Paris compliant. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all for today. The next press conference is on 26 October after the External Governing Council in Athens. Up until then, I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.